The morning sun danced across Lake Willowbrook as I sipped coffee on my back deck. This view was what sold me on the property 3 years ago. After a decade of saving every penny from my accounting job in the city, I had finally found my sanctuary. The water rippled with gentle morning breezes, ducks glided effortlessly near the shore, and the stress of corporate life seemed to dissolve into the mist that hovered above the surface. The real estate agent had mentioned there was an HOA, but assured me they were reasonable. The monthly fees maintained the community playground, entrance landscaping, and helped fund the annual summer festival. Small price to pay for paradise, I thought. I signed the papers without hesitation, becoming the proud owner of 246 Lakeview Drive. My first summer was everything I had dreamed of. My grandfather had passed away that spring, leaving me his old aluminum fishing boat. It was nothing fancy, weathered and showing its age with patches of mismatched paint and a motor that sometimes needed extra coaxing. But it was priceless to me. Every weekend during my childhood, we had set out at dawn to find the perfect fishing spot. Now the boat rested on its trailer beside my house, ready for new adventures. The neighbors seemed friendly enough. The Patels next door invited me to their cookout that first month. The elderly couple across the street brought homemade bread when I moved in. Everyone waved when I launched the boat from my private dock. Lake life seemed idyllic, exactly the escape I had been searching for. The first notice appeared 6 months after I moved in. A yellow piece of paper tucked into my door frame about mailbox compliance. The font needed to be Times New Roman, not Arial. I found it peculiar but made the change. 2 weeks later, another notice about lawn height exceeding the allowed 4 inches. I complied again, adjusting my mowing schedule. Then Margaret Holloway was elected HOA president. I met her at the quarterly community meeting. Perfectly coiffed gray hair, expensive jewelry that caught the light when she gestured, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She spoke about community standards and property values with the intensity of someone discussing national security. The notices increased in frequency. My hedges were 2 inches too tall. My garbage can remain visible from the street for more than 12 hours. Each violation seemed more trivial than the last, but I adjusted, wanting to be a good neighbor. The boat, however, became a particular focus. While parked alongside my house, apparently it disrupted community aesthetics. I reviewed the HOA documentation carefully one evening, searching for specific regulations about boat storage. The guidelines were surprisingly vague. A paragraph written in 1986 about recreational vehicles needing to be stored appropriately. Nothing specifically prohibiting boats, nothing about side yard storage, nothing that clearly applied to my situation. That night, looking out across the water that had once brought me such peace, I felt the first stirrings of anxiety. Lake Willowbrook still gleamed under the moonlight, but it no longer felt entirely like freedom. Instead, it felt like something I needed to protect. From my deck, I could see straight across to the large colonial house where Margaret lived. Her windows were dark, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. When the first official warning about my boat arrived, printed on bright yellow paper with violation stamped across the top, something inside me shifted. The lake that had represented peace now reflected uncertainty. The sanctuary I had worked so hard to create now felt threatened. That evening, as the sun set over the water, I watched ducks return to their nests along the shoreline, creatures unconcerned with property values or community aesthetics. I envied their freedom as I wondered when the next notice would arrive. The notices continued through the winter and into spring. Yellow papers gave way to orange ones, then finally to bright red. Each one cited regulations about my boat that seemed to change with the wind. One week, the issue was improper storage location. The next, It was uncovered recreational equipment. After that, aesthetic inconsistency with neighborhood character. I began documenting everything methodically. Every notice went into a binder with the date and time received. I drove through the neighborhood taking photographs of other boats, jet skis, and kayaks stored in side yards identical to mine. The Henderson family 3 streets over had 2 bass boats uncovered in their driveway. The Millers stored a pontoon boat visible from the main road, yet neither received citations. My emails to the HOA board requesting clarification went unanswered for weeks, then received vague responses about case-by-case evaluation and board discretion. Phone calls reached voicemail graveyards. It was as if I had been placed on some invisible blacklist. May arrived with warming temperatures and the quarterly HOA meeting. I arrived early, clutching my folder of documentation. The community center meeting room filled quickly with residents in polo shirts and sundresses, many nodding in recognition as I took a seat near the front. Margaret presided at the center of the long table, flanked by 4 other board members who seemed to function mostly as nodding accessories. When the floor opened for resident comments, I approached the podium. The room fell uncomfortably silent. Even the usual whispers ceased. My voice sounded louder than intended in the quiet space as I explained my situation. I have received 7 notices regarding my boat storage over the past 3 months, I said, holding up my folder. Yet the HOA guidelines contain no specific prohibition against storing boats beside homes. Furthermore, at least 12 other properties currently store watercraft in identical ways without citation. Margaret tapped her pen against the table, her crimson lipstick stretching into what approximated a smile without any actual warmth behind it. "We appreciate your concerns," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "However, these are unfortunate misunderstandings of clear policy. The board has discretion to interpret community standards as needed to maintain property values." "But there is no clear policy," I persisted. "The documentation is vague and—" "Your 3 minutes are up," she interrupted, gesturing to the next speaker. "Next issue, please." I stood frozen for a moment before returning to my seat, cheeks burning with frustration and embarrassment. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened, but I noticed several residents glancing my way with what looked like sympathy. In the parking lot afterward, a man approached as I unlocked my car. Richard Parker from 3 doors down, a retired professor I had seen walking his golden retriever most mornings. "She did the same to the Johnsons last year," he whispered, eyes darting around to ensure we were alone. "Their lake access was restricted until they sold to her cousin at a loss." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Margaret has connections to some development company. They have been buying up lakefront properties gradually, always after the HOA makes life difficult for the owners." He patted my shoulder. "Just watch yourself. You are not the first to be targeted." Over the following weeks, I spoke with other neighbors discreetly. A pattern emerged: selective enforcement designed to pressure certain homeowners to sell. The targets were always properties with lake access, always after months of escalating violations, always resulting in sales below market value. The certified letter arrived on a Friday afternoon. Official HOA letterhead, Margaret's flowing signature at the bottom. The boat was to be removed from my property within 72 hours, or it would be towed at my expense. The deadline gave me until Monday, just 1 weekend to either surrender or find leverage in this increasingly personal war. That night, I sat on my dock watching lights reflect across the darkened lake surface. This was never about community standards or property values. The lakefront properties were being systematically targeted, and I was next in line. But unlike those before me, I had no intention of surrendering what my grandfather had entrusted to me. If Margaret wanted a fight, she was about to get one. Saturday morning arrived with a sense of urgency. With only 48 hours remaining before the towing deadline, I needed answers fast. My first instinct was to contact a lawyer, but weekend rates would be astronomical. Instead, I called Emma, a law school friend who specialized in real estate matters. "Meet me at the county records department in an hour," she said after I explained my situation. "Bring every document you have related to your property purchase." The county records department occupied the basement of an aging government building downtown. The lighting was harsh fluorescent, the air stale with the smell of old paper and dust. Ancient filing cabinets lined the walls and faded maps hung in glass cases. Emma was waiting when I arrived, professional in a blazer despite the weekend. "HOA disputes are more common than you think," she explained as we settled at a large table. "But before we fight their rules, we need to understand exactly what authority they actually have." For the next 4 hours, we combed through property records, pulling the original surveys of Lake Willowbrook and the surrounding development. The microfiche machine hummed as decades-old documents scrolled before us. Emma pulled up my deed first, then expanded outward to neighboring properties, then the HOA incorporation documents from 1986. "Wait," she said suddenly, finger tracing a line on an oversized survey map dated 1973. "Look at this boundary demarcation." The yellowed map showed the original land survey before any homes were built. A thick black line clearly separated the residential parcels from the lake itself. "The lake is designated as a separate entity," Emma explained, excitement growing in her voice. "According to this, Lake Willowbrook was never incorporated into the residential development. It remains a distinct property with its own deed." We dug deeper, locating the original lake deed that confirmed Emma's observation. Lake Willowbrook had been created in the 1950s when a local farmer dammed a natural spring to form a reservoir. When the residential development began in the 1970s, the lake remained separate from the housing parcels, though homeowners were granted explicit water access rights. "The HOA formed in 1986, Emma continued, pulling the articles of incorporation, but they never acquired legal jurisdiction over the lake itself. They control the homes and common areas, but not the water or structures that extend into it. Your dock, your boat when it is on the water, those are outside their authority." The revelation hit me like a thunderclap. Their towing threats hinged on authority they never actually possessed. Years of enforcing lake regulations, and no one had questioned their right to do so. "There is more," Emma said, pulling up recent property transfer records. "Look at the sales history of lakefront properties over the past 5 years." A pattern emerged from the dry legal language. 6 lakefront homes had sold in the past 5 years, all at 10 to 15% below market value. All purchased by various LLCs that, upon closer inspection, linked back to a company called Lakeview Holdings. "Cross-reference that with the HOA complaint records," Emma suggested. Using my HOA login, I pulled up board meeting minutes. Each property that sold had been subject to intensive violation complaints in the months prior to sale. Boat restrictions, dock violations, shoreline maintenance issues, the same pattern of selective enforcement I had experienced. Emma pulled up the company registration for Lakeview Holdings. There, listed as a founding partner, was Margaret Holloway's signature. She is using HOA regulations to pressure owners to sell, then buying the properties through her company, I whispered, the pieces finally coming together. Not just buying them, Emma corrected. According to these filings, Lakeview Holdings submitted a proposal to the county last month for lakefront condominium development. They are acquiring properties for future development. The most damning evidence came last. We found the original water rights certificates issued to each lakefront property. My deed, like all others along the shoreline, included explicit water access rights that predated the HOA by decades, rights that could not be revoked by HOA regulations. By late afternoon, my dining room table had become command central. Property maps, deed records, company filings, and HOA documents spread across the surface. I organized everything into 3 neat folders labeled Lake Jurisdiction, Property Rights, and Conflict of Interest. The pieces were all there, hidden in plain sight for decades. The HOA had been wielding phantom authority over the lake, and no one had thought to question it until they pushed too far with me. The balance of power was about to shift dramatically, and Margaret had no idea what was coming. After years of using bureaucracy as a weapon against homeowners, she was about to face someone who had found the fatal flaw in her system. Monday morning arrived with a sense of purpose I had not felt in months. The towing deadline loomed at 5:00 p.m., but instead of moving my boat, I made a phone call. The law office of Hernandez and Associates specialized in HOA disputes. Their receptionist connected me to Catherine Hernandez herself after I mentioned Emma's name. "Fascinating case," Catherine said after I explained my findings. "These jurisdictional overreach situations happen more often than you might think, but the conflict of interest angle makes this particularly egregious." We scheduled a consultation for that afternoon. Before heading to her office, I moved my boat from the side yard to my garage, not surrendering, just buying time until our strategy was set. Catherine's office overlooked the city skyline, all leather chairs and dark wood. She examined our evidence with practiced precision, nodding occasionally as she flipped through property maps and deeds. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, studying the 1973 land survey. "The HOA has been operating under a jurisdictional illusion for decades. Your documentation clearly shows they have no authority over lake structures or the lake itself." She leaned back in her chair. "We could file an injunction today, but that gives them time to prepare. I suggest a more strategic approach. Force them to reveal their overreach publicly, where the entire community can witness it." Together, we developed a 3-phase strategy. First, documentation and coalition building. Second, formal legal notices. Third, public confrontation with full community awareness. "These, like eviction notices, need to be legally precise," Catherine explained, drafting what she called cease and desist orders. Formal documents prohibiting HOA representatives from accessing or regulating water-based structures attached to privately owned docks. Each notice was crafted on legal letterhead, with county records attached as exhibits. The language was clear and authoritative, the exact bureaucratic tone the HOA had used against homeowners for years. "Now for the coalition," Catherine said. "You mentioned other affected homeowners." That evening, I invited Richard Parker to my home. He arrived looking nervous but brought 2 other lakefront owners, the Richardsons and Mrs. Chen. I explained my discoveries about lake jurisdiction while they examined the documents spread across my dining room table. "They threatened to fine me $500 for my dock color last month," Mrs. Chen said softly. "I painted it their approved color the next day. I am a widow living on fixed income. I cannot afford these constant charges." The Richardsons nodded grimly. "Our children cannot even leave their kayaks by the water overnight without violation notices." One by one, they shared stories of selective enforcement, arbitrary rule changes, and mounting financial pressure. Richard confirmed that 4 families had already sold their lakefront properties after similar treatment. "The quarterly HOA meeting is Thursday night," I explained. "Margaret plans to announce her new lakefront beautification initiative, likely another attempt to control lake access. That gives us 3 days to gather more support." We moved cautiously but deliberately. The Richardsons contacted the Changs and the elderly Gonzalez couple. Mrs. Chen knew the Jacksons and the Smiths. By Wednesday, 12 lakefront homeowners had joined our coalition, each with their own stories of HOA overreach. We created a private social media group called Lake Willowbrook Property Rights to document every interaction, every notice, every selective enforcement incident. The pattern of abuse became undeniable when viewed collectively. Catherine prepared individual lake eviction notices for each HOA board member, along with a comprehensive cease and desist order regarding lake jurisdiction. The documents were professionally bound with blue backing and gold fasteners, imposing legal instruments impossible to dismiss. "The timing must be perfect," Catherine advised during our final meeting. "Wait for Margaret to begin her lakefront initiative announcement. That creates the ideal context for challenging their authority." The night before the meeting, I reviewed our strategy one final time. Every affected homeowner knew their role. Every document was in perfect order. Every legal argument was backed by county records. We had transformed from isolated homeowners suffering individual harassment into an organized coalition with the law firmly on our side. That evening, I walked down to my dock and looked across the water. Margaret's house stood illuminated on the opposite shore, windows glowing with warm light. She had no idea what awaited her tomorrow. The HOA had threatened to tow my grandfather's boat, thinking I would fold like others before me. Instead, they had inadvertently revealed their most critical vulnerability. As I prepared the final stack of notices on my dining room table that night, my hands remained steady. Tomorrow would change everything for Lake Willowbrook. The balance of power was about to shift permanently, and I would be the catalyst. I ran my fingers over the raised seal on the legal documents and smiled. Sometimes justice arrives with paperwork, not pitchforks. Thursday evening arrived with unusual energy in the air. The community center parking lot was nearly full when I pulled in 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting time. Our coalition members arrived individually to avoid drawing attention, each nodding subtly as they passed me in the lobby. Catherine had helped me prepare a simple presentation, just 5 slides showing the original lake survey, property deeds, and relevant legal precedents. A flash drive containing these materials rested in my pocket, heavy with potential. The meeting room filled quickly. Normally, HOA meetings attracted maybe 20 residents. Tonight, nearly 60 people crowded the space, many standing along the back wall. Margaret noticed the unusual attendance, her eyes narrowing slightly as she arranged her papers at the center of the long table. The other 4 board members flanked her: Robert, the retired banker, Susan from the North Side, Timothy, who owned the local hardware store, and Ellen, who rarely spoke. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Margaret rapped her gavel with practiced authority. "Welcome to the quarterly meeting of the Lake Willowbrook Homeowners Association," she announced, voice crisp and confident. "We have a full agenda tonight, beginning with the treasurer's report, followed by old business, and concluding with our exciting new lakefront beautification initiative. The meeting proceeded with mundane matters, budget reviews, approval of previous minutes, a discussion about replacing the playground equipment. I sat quietly, legal portfolio in my lap, watching Margaret control the room with practiced efficiency. She occasionally glanced my way, perhaps nodding my boat had disappeared from its usual spot. Finally, after 40 minutes of routine business, Margaret transitioned to her main agenda item. "Now for our most exciting announcement," she said, smiling broadly. "The board has unanimously approved our new lakefront beautification initiative, which will standardize all dock structures, boat storage, and shoreline landscaping to enhance property values throughout our community." She clicked to a PowerPoint slide showing architectural renderings of identical white docks and boathouses. Beginning next month, all lakefront properties will need to comply with these new design standards. The HOA will conduct inspections and issue necessary improvement notices. We expect full compliance within 60 days. She paused, surveying the room with satisfaction, unaware of what was about to happen. "We will now open the floor for public comments," she continued. "Please limit remarks to 3 minutes." I stood and approached the podium, leather portfolio tucked under my arm. Around the room, our coalition members straightened in their seats. "Before we discuss any new lakefront initiatives," I began evenly, "there is a jurisdictional matter that requires immediate attention." Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I removed my flash drive and handed it to Timothy, who managed the computer for presentations. "If you could please display these documents," I requested politely. The projector hummed to life, displaying the original county survey from 1973. The HOA has been issuing violations regarding lake structures and watercraft despite having no legal authority over the water itself, I stated clearly. The room grew completely silent. This original land survey clearly delineates the lake as separate from the residential parcels. The HOA, formed in 1986, never acquired legal jurisdiction over Lake Willowbrook. I advanced to the next slide, showing the water rights certificates. Furthermore, our property deeds include explicit water access rights that predate the HOA by over a decade, rights that cannot be revoked by HOA regulations. Margaret's face tightened as whispers spread through the audience. "This is absurd," she interrupted, but her voice carried a new tremor of uncertainty. "County records do not lie, Mrs. Holloway," I replied calmly. "Your board has been enforcing regulations over property you have no legal authority to govern." The moment had arrived. I gestured subtly toward the door where Catherine stood. She entered, followed by 12 lakefront homeowners who moved in unison toward the front of the room. "On behalf of the legitimate stakeholders of Lake Willowbrook," I announced, approaching the board table, "I am serving each board member with a formal cease and desist regarding lake access and regulation." The room erupted as I placed the notices before each stunned board member. Residents stood for a better view. Phone cameras captured the moment. Margaret stared at the document before her, face flushing crimson as she realized what was happening. Her own tactics turned against her with devastating precision. "This legal notice prohibits the HOA from regulating, restricting, or enforcing any rules regarding docks, boats, or any structures extending into Lake Willowbrook," I explained, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Additionally, we have documented evidence of selective enforcement targeting lakefront properties, coinciding with below-market acquisitions by Lakeview Holdings, a development company listing Margaret Holloway as a founding partner." Gasps filled the room as this conflict of interest became public knowledge. These notices have been filed with the county clerk and copies sent to the State Real Estate Commission. I continued, voice steady despite my pounding heart. You have 24 hours to rescind all outstanding boat and dock violations, or we proceed with injunctive relief and damages for years of unauthorized enforcement. Margaret attempted to regain control, reaching for her gavel, but it slipped from her grasp, rolling across the table before clattering to the floor in perfect symbolism of power, suddenly unbalanced. Robert, the retired banker, picked up his notice and began reading carefully. "Margaret," he said slowly, "is this survey accurate? Does the HOA truly lack jurisdiction over the lake itself?" The question hung in the air as Margaret struggled to formulate a response. The other board members examined their notices with growing concern. "This meeting is adjourned pending legal review," Margaret finally announced, voice strained and lacking its usual authority. As residents filed out, many stopped to examine the projected survey still displayed on the screen. Years of assumed authority had been challenged in 15 minutes of documentation and determination. I exchanged quiet nods with our coalition members, knowing the real battle was just beginning, but the first crucial victory had been secured. The community now knew the truth. The emergency board meeting began less than an hour after the public confrontation ended. Through the glass doors of the community center, residents watched board members engaged in heated discussion. Margaret gestured emphatically, while Robert repeatedly pointed to the legal documents before them. The debate continued until nearly midnight, their silhouettes visible against the interior lights long after most onlookers had gone home. By morning, the community buzzed with discussion. The neighborhood message boards overflowed with comments, theories, and personal accounts of HOA enforcement issues. Several residents shared photos of the lake survey document from the meeting, prompting detailed analysis of property rights and boundaries. The quiet suburban community had transformed overnight into a hotbed of legal speculation and neighborhood politics. 3 days after the meeting, a memo from the HOA attorney was distributed to board members, and promptly leaked by a sympathetic member to our coalition. The document acknowledged the concerning jurisdictional questions that required immediate legal review and advised the board to suspend enforcement of lake-related regulations pending resolution of property boundary matters. Margaret launched her counteroffensive through a community-wide email. Her message spoke of working together to clarify historical agreements and the importance of community harmony. The sugary language could not disguise the defensive retreat underway. She requested patience during this administrative review period, bureaucratic code for buying time while searching for leverage. The most startling development arrived in my mailbox 5 days after the confrontation. An anonymous manila envelope containing corporate filings connecting Margaret to 3 separate development companies that had acquired foreclosed or distressed lakefront properties over the past 5 years. Property after property, each sale following aggressive HOA enforcement actions. The documents included preliminary architectural plans for Lake Willowbrook luxury condominiums, 18 upscale units replacing 6 former single-family homes. Our coalition shared these findings with the local newspaper. The following Monday, the Willowbrook Gazette ran a front-page story titled "Lake Rights Battle Exposes HOA Overreach," featuring my grandfather's boat prominently in the accompanying photos. The reporter had interviewed several coalition members and attempted to contact Margaret, who declined comment. At the grocery store that afternoon, neighbors I had barely spoken with approached me in the produce section. "My sister lives in Oak Ridge Hills," one woman told me. Their HOA tried pulling the same thing with their community pond. These power trips are everywhere. The official board statement came 5 days after the newspaper article, a carefully worded acknowledgement that certain water-based regulations would be suspended pending legal review. They did not surrender completely, but the crack in their armor was visible to everyone. Property values along the lakefront immediately increased as word spread that the restrictive enforcement was being challenged. Real estate websites showed 3 new lakefront listings at prices 15% higher than similar recent sales. The market was responding to the promise of ownership without overbearing restrictions. Most satisfying was watching board members during their regular inspection rounds, where once they strode confidently onto docks and photographed boats with official self-importance, now they awkwardly navigated around the shoreline, carefully avoiding stepping onto any structure extending into the water. They understood their authority had clear boundaries now, quite literally. Margaret herself became noticeably absent from community spaces. Her usual morning power walks around the lake ceased. Her windows remained curtained. The development company's website removed all mentions of planned lakefront condominiums. The county commissioner opened an investigation into potential conflicts of interest in local HOAs, specifically citing the troubling pattern of selective enforcement followed by below-market acquisitions at Lake Willowbrook. While careful not to name Margaret directly, the announcement referenced exactly the pattern we had documented. The transformation had begun. The community that once functioned through fear and compliance now buzzed with engagement and questions. Residents studied their deeds, researched property rights, and spoke openly about governance and fairness. What Margaret had intended as her crowning achievement, the Lakefront Beautification Initiative, had instead become the catalyst for her undoing. The power dynamic had shifted fundamentally, and there would be no going back to the old order. Spring arrived at Lake Willowbrook with bursts of color and renewed energy. The dogwood trees lining the shoreline bloomed with delicate white flowers, and mallard ducks returned to build nests in the protected coves. The water level rose with seasonal rains, creating the perfect conditions for fishing. The first meeting of the newly formed Lake Willowbrook Association took place on my expansive deck on a Saturday morning in April. 27 waterfront owners gathered with coffee and pastries, the mood notably different from the tense HOA meetings of the past. Catherine had helped us draft simple bylaws focused on conservation and reasonable use guidelines rather than restrictive regulations. When nominations opened for association president, several voices called my name. I declined politely, instead accepting a position on the advisory committee where I could help shape reasonable policies without becoming what I had fought against. The presidency went to Richard Parker, the retired professor whose early warning had set everything in motion. Our first principle must be balance, Richard announced at his election. Between use and conservation, between individual rights and community standards, between enjoyment and stewardship. The collaborative approach yielded simple, clear guidelines for boat storage that protected property values while respecting individual rights. Docks could be maintained in safe condition and painted in any of 12 approved colors, a spectrum wide enough to allow personal expression while maintaining some aesthetic cohesion. Margaret resigned from the HOA board 2 weeks after the county commissioner opened his investigation into conflicts of interest. Her resignation letter cited personal reasons and new opportunities rather than acknowledging any wrongdoing. The for sale sign appeared in front of her colonial house the following week. The remaining HOA board members, freed from her influence, proved surprisingly reasonable partners in redefining boundaries, both literal and figurative. Robert, the retired banker who had questioned Margaret during the confrontation, reached out to establish regular communication between the HOA and the Lake Association. The two groups gradually defined complementary roles, the HOA managing community infrastructure, while the Lake Association oversaw water-related matters. My boat received a fresh coat of paint, matching the blue trim of my house, and returned to its rightful place beside my dock. What once represented conflict now symbolized something larger than personal victory: the power of documentation, determination, and community action in the face of overreach. On warm evenings, neighbors gathered at the community pier. We collectively restored, sharing stories as the sun set over water that belonged to all of us and none of us. The transformation from conflict to community happened gradually. Then suddenly, fear replaced by mutual respect, rigid rules by common sense. This morning, I drifted in my grandfather's boat to his favorite fishing spot. The rod he taught me to cast with balanced perfectly in my hands. The water remains the same as it always was, but something fundamental has shifted in how we relate to it and to each other. Some battles are not about winning, but about restoring balance. As I watch the sunrise reflect across the calm surface, I understand that protecting what matters sometimes requires standing against the current, even when it seems too strong to resist.